Hello, everyone. Sorry about that late start. We were just sorting out a few little technical things on our end. As you can see, we've all arrived, including this charming little puppet living on Galliano Island. I'm just going to give us a quick introduction before we get started with our presenters. So this is the fourth in a series of 5 Lunch and Learn webinars organized by Raincoast Conservation Foundation to explore some complex environmental issues currently being faced by governments at all levels, and also exploring the options to address these issues through policy and environmental protection strategies. So my name is Shauna Dahl. I work for Raincoast Conservation Foundation as the Gulf Islands Forest Project Coordinator. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Persia, who is going to really bring us in and ground us in this place. So I'm going to pass things over to Persia.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining Shauna, today's presenters, and myself here today for our discussion on the ecological carrying capacity of island ecosystems. The coastal regions that many of us call home are characteristically dynamic landscapes, which host some of the most diversity on the planet. These regions are also in a delicate balance at the land-sea interface, making these landscapes susceptible to climate change impacts. And increasingly, coastal regions are becoming hubs for dense human settlements, which is further exacerbating the climate and biodiversity crises. To quantify the impacts of human and non-human effects, researchers have utilized concepts and tools such as carrying capacity and ecological footprinting to better understand if our environments can support our current and future resource use. So today we are joined by some amazing researchers and practitioners in our communities to investigate how these concepts can be applied to current challenges of sustainable development and consumption on the islands. Before we get started here today in earnest, I would like to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the traditional unceded territory of the Tongan-speaking people, the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, but I often work on the traditional territories of the Hosanich nations, the saltwater people, who call the Southern Gulf Islands home. I'd now like to also recognize the dozens of additional distinct Coast Salish nations on whose territories most of us in attendance today are uninvited but grateful guests. I'd also like to encourage everyone attending here today to head to the chat and let us know whose territory you are calling in from. And I'll pass it over to Shauna for a couple notes on housekeeping.
Yeah, so just so folks know, if you haven't attended one of these webinars before, you're able to interact with us via the chat on either platform, Facebook or YouTube. I will be collecting questions throughout this session, and we'll pose those questions to the presenters. We'll take about 1 or 2 questions after each presenter wraps up their presentation, so you have a chance to interact with them directly, and then we'll have a full-on discussion period at the end. So if you don't hear your question right away, don't worry, we'll try to get to it by the end of the session today. So yeah, please feel free to let us know where you're calling in from in the chat. Someone's calling in from Edmonton. Great to have you here. It's always nice to have folks from far and wide join us on these webinars. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker. I believe that is my job right now. Or is it Persia's job? Persia, it's your job to introduce our first speaker. So I'll give it back to you, Persia, and then we will get started.
Awesome. Thank you, Shauna. And for a quick overview of some of the concepts that we're going to cover today, many of us are familiar with this concept of carrying capacity. We often use carrying capacity to describe a system's limits. For example, a species' ability to exist in an area is dictated by environmental factors and resource availability. And based on these factors, the environment can only support a population of certain size. Conventional notions of carrying capacity describe the maximum number of species that an environment can support. But when considering human influence, economists have argued that technology and improved resource productivity can actually increase an environment's carrying capacity, making this concept a little less relevant for understanding the impact of human settlement. When it comes to human use, determining the carrying capacity of a specific system, such as an island ecosystem, may be challenging because this tool's accuracy depends on behavioral predictability, and human behavior is typically highly variable, as we know. So the concept of ecological footprinting was introduced to do the inverse of carrying capacity. So rather than a speculative approach using carrying capacity, ecological footprinting accounts for past and present resource use to understand how much area is required to support a population. Through the use of historical accounting, ecological footprinting is a tool that is used to understand sustainable and unsustainable human consumption. Both carrying capacity and ecological footprinting provide a quantitative basis for evaluating impacts on the environment, making these concepts useful for examining island ecosystems where population density is increasing at a rapid rate. Today, our presenters will elaborate on carrying capacity, the ecological footprint, and current applications of these concepts in island ecosystems. And with that, I would like to introduce our first presenter today. Dr. Tara Martin is a professor in conservation decision science with the Department of Forest and Conservation Sciences in the Faculty of Forestry at the University of British Columbia. She's a pioneer in the field of conservation decision science, combining predictive ecological models with decision science to inform what actions to take, where to take them, and when to achieve our conservation and natural resource management goals. So with that, I will hand the floor over to Dr. Tara Martin. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that introduction. Let's get now, are you able to see my presenter screen?
Looks great.
Super. Well, thanks everyone for joining us this midday on a bit of a rainy day on the West Coast. I'm joining you from the unceded lands of the Musqueam at the UBC campus, but I was born on Salt Spring Island in the Gulf Islands, the unceded territories of the Penelakut, Cowichan, and Wasanic nations. I lead the conservation decisions team here at UBC. I'm a professor in conservation science, and what the main kind of focus of our work is around understanding cumulative impacts to ecosystems. And based on what we find, we then transform that knowledge into solutions, into management strategies that we can take to restore and conserve and protect and steward these ecosystems. So growing up in these landscapes, I spent a lot of time, obviously, thinking about these places, observing these places, and for the last 20 years, collecting data on these places. And in my lifetime, I've watched ecosystems transform from meadows like this, where we have a bounty of incredible flora that support a diverse range of birds and pollinators, to landscapes like this. And now this is the image that most of you who are familiar with the Gulf and San Juan Islands in this archipelago, this image would be very familiar to you. Whereas the previous image may not be very familiar to you. So I've watched this transformation over the last 40 plus years, and I've started to try to untangle what is driving this transformation. This is an island in the Salish Sea. This is what a diverse understory of our forest should be looking like. But this is kind of more commonly what we encounter. And on some islands, this is what we encounter. And so what is driving all of those transformations? I want to think about this quote from Daniel Pauly. So over 30 years ago, Daniel Pauly, who's a renowned fisheries scientist here at UBC, he put forward this concept of shifting baselines. And he says, we alter the world, but we forget what it was like beforehand. And each subsequent generation regards a progressively poorer natural world as normal. So this is what's happening in the Gulf Islands. We have this phenomena of shifting baselines. When Daniel first put this forward, he was talking about fisheries, the fact that, 100 years ago, you could go out and catch this bounty of fish, whereas today, when you go out to those same places, it's very hard to even catch a single fish. These things happen slowly over time. And, when my children walk through these ecosystems today, what they observe is what they think is normal. So we all have this idea of what we think is normal, but slowly that normal is shifting. and ecologically we're accepting as normal less and less. So what has been driving our ecosystems within the Salish Sea to go from these images, on the left to these images on the right? I should note that these images were taken on in April this year, and they were taken on the same day. So this is not a seasonal difference. So what's driving the changes? Well, one of the changes has been this disruption of what we call trophic cascades. So trophic cascades are these linkages that link ecosystems together through these food webs. So the loss of predators in these ecosystems, the loss of cougars, the loss of wolves, and to a lesser extent, the loss of bears, have had a profound impact on their prey, in particular black-tailed deer. We've also lost hunting. So First Nations who lived throughout these ecosystems were hunting. Early settlers were also hunting. But in the last 50 years or so, there's been very little hunting throughout these islands. And so we have this escalation of herbivores, black-tailed deer, which are now eating most things out of house and home. Of course, we've also had enormous land use change throughout this region. The coastal Douglas fir bioclimatic zone is the most threatened bioclimatic zone in the province. And within that, Garry Oak ecosystems are the most threatened ecosystem in Canada. So we have very little of these intact ecosystems left. But what we do have left and what has been protected is continuing to be degraded. And so we ask ourselves why? Why, if we look at the Gulf Island National Park, this area where there is no more, land use change, why are we still losing species in these ecosystems? And a lot of that can be explained when we think about how these ecosystems evolved in the first place. These are ecocultural landscapes. These are landscapes which evolved over millennia with the stewardship of First Nations in these places. And they were using these landscapes and tending to these landscapes in very important and particular ways. There is cultural burning of the landscapes. There is intense plant propagation and weeding. They're tending to these incredible food gardens. And of course, they were hunting. And then we have climate change more recently, which is exerting pressures on and amplifying all of these other threatening processes. So where the risk of fire is being amplified by browsing, by losing this understory, this dense understory, which can act as a fire retardant. The loss of that understory is then drying out the soil horizon. We have increasing fire weather, and that increases overall fire risk. And climate change is also is bringing about new risks too, in terms of dieback of red cedar, for example. So black-tailed deer, they're native to this system, but the system is now out of balance. Across many of these islands, the density of deer is 10 to 100 times what it was historically. So my colleagues and I have written a lot of papers on this issue and have had them published in various journals. But I find that pictures are the best way to tell this story. So browsing, first and foremost, leads to this loss of understory biomass, understory structure, and understory species diversity. So on the left, we have islands where there's less than 0.01 deer per hectare. That's 1 deer per 100 hectares, and you can see that in this image, if you can see my cursor, this is that lush, diverse understory. Lots of shrubs and ferns. And then here we have a common shrub, ocean spray, in its natural state, this full-bodied shrub from its apex down to the forest floor. This is where we get densities of sort of 0.1 to 0.5 deer per hectare. We've lost a huge amount of biomass in the understory. And then we start in this shrub ocean spray, we start to get this kind of umbrella structure of the ocean spray. And then finally to this very high level of deer density where we've got a complete loss of understory. And these ocean spray are really the living dead. You know, they're trying to sprout out from the bottom in response to browsing, but all of those new shoots get browsed off. And eventually they will die, and because there is no recruitment, they will not be replaced. So we can show that with data, and we can show that statistically there's a huge difference between islands that have a low level of deer on them and islands that have kind of moderate and high levels of deer in that key structural phase, kind of 0.5 to 1.5 meter strata. So that in turn causes a cascade and impact into our songbirds. So our songbirds throughout the archipelago rely on our forests and our meadows for nesting and foraging opportunities. And the loss of that understory vegetation impacts a particular cohort of our songbirds more than others. So the species that rely on the canopy, we find are doing fairly well. They're not being hugely impacted, but those species that rely on the shrubs and on the ground layer for foraging and nesting are the species that we're seeing huge declines. And so again, we have data that kind of backs this trend up, where we've got, you know, the highest numbers of these different bird species on these islands that have very low or even no deer on these islands. And as we increase the deer density, the abundance of these bird species decreases. Deer browsing is also leading to the loss of these culturally significant plant species. Throughout the Salish Sea, First Nations relied on many species for medicines and for food. And two such species, we have sea blush and we have camas. The colleagues of mine, Emily Gonzalez and Peter Arcisse, did a beautiful experiment where they tested whether it was competition or herbivory, which was driving the decline of these two different species. And they used exclosures to test these ideas. And they found that when within these exclosures, when deer were excluded, the number of sea blush stems increased dramatically, whereas competition with other exotic plants really had little impact on the number of sea blush stems. Likewise, when we looked at the camas, the bulb of the size of the bulb of camas. So this is a species that produces a corm, not unlike a daffodil or a tulip. And when those species when deer were excluded, we found that the mass of the camas bulbs increased quite dramatically. So camas declines under browsing. We have two species of camas. We have common camas, Quamash, Camassia quamash, and we have gray camas, Camassia liclinii. These were incredibly important sources of dietary carbohydrates for the Coast Salish First Nations, and this plant was traded, you know, up and down the coast and inland. And work by Nancy Turner and Beckwith estimates that, you know, in a particular camas garden, there's around 400 bulbs being harvested an hour. It's between, you know, 36 and 40 kilograms a day. And say within the Salish Sea, that's around 1 to 2.3 million bulbs for every 1,000 people a year. So this was a huge harvesting operation, and you can just see the size of the bulbs in that image. These are the size of sort of small to medium-sized potatoes. It'd be very hard. You'd be hard pressed to find a camas bulb that large today, and you'd certainly not be able to find an area that you could harvest that many bulbs per hour. So it speaks to the decline in the extent of this species as a result of land conversion and browsing pressure. So I dream of a day when I can, maybe take my grandchildren through a meadow like this and actually harvest a camas. This is a great quote from James Swan in 1857. He was a 19th century ethnographer and naturalist. And he says, "I never have met with a white person who is not fond of baked camas, and I do not know any vegetable except fried bananas so delicious." I mean, what a delight would it be if we could go out and actually harvest this plant and share in that experience. One of my master's students, Kefra Beckett, is looking at the impact of browsing by deer on bumblebees. So bumblebees are a very important generalist pollinator throughout the Salish Sea. And this is just a picture of Kefra and my research assistant, Abby Sherwood. On the left, we have a site where deer are present. This is Tumbo Island, one of the islands in the Gulf Island National Park. And on the right, we have an image where deer are absent. It's, you almost, again, the images tell the story. There's very little resources for pollinators on these islands where deer are present, whereas on islands where deer are absent, there's extraordinary floral resources, and that's what Kefra is finding, is that bumblebees are obviously responding to these floral resources, and there are much higher numbers on these islands where deer are absent. I want to switch to now so we have a very good understanding now of what the drivers are of these changes, and I wanted to shift to a story about ecocultural restoration. As I said, these are ecocultural landscapes. These meadow landscapes and Douglas fir landscapes were tended by First Nations for millennia, and a lot of the stewardship practices that they used are the practices that we need to think about reinstating if we want to bring back these ecosystems and restore these ecosystems. So 3 years ago, this island called Halibut Island, or Sisqueenum in Senchothan, came up for sale. And this is an island that I had the pleasure of boating past many times as a child. And later, when I was doing research during my postdoc, I had met the landholder at the time of that island, and came to realize that this island was very important ecologically. The owner of the island, Hilton Burry, he passed away several years ago, and the island was then put up for sale by the estate, and I contacted the real estate agents, and asked if I could do a full floristic and fauna survey on the island. And unfortunately, he allowed me access. And what I found was absolutely extraordinary. This island was knee deep in wildflowers. It was just an incredible example of a baseline, of a historical baseline of what these ecosystems used to look like. And so from that moment, I decided that I needed to find a way for that island to be protected and to be put back into the hands of the Wasanic nations. And so I was fortunate in that I was able to find a donor that actually transferred the funds to the Land Conservancy. The island was purchased, and now we are working with the Land Conservancy and the Wasanic Nations to draw up a covenant to protect that island in perpetuity. And the wonderful thing about that covenant is we're drawing on Senchothan laws, Wasanich laws, to draw up that actual covenant. And so this was a really historic day when we got to invite the Wasanic leadership to this island, and it was the first time that they had set foot on this island on a very, very long time. When you enter this island, you're immediately struck by the incredible flora and the extent of camas, these incredible camas gardens, things like kakmin, this lomatium, which is a very important medicinal plant, fields of fawn lilies, these wonderful, this plant called naked broomrape, which has a terrible name but is delightful. Huge chocolate lilies with stems as thick as my thumb. And just a magnificent place that helps us understand what these places used to look like before we changed them so heavily. So what have we learned in our work over the last couple of decades? Well, first and foremost, the loss of First Nation stewardship, including the loss of top predators, is contributing to this phenomena of shifting baselines of what we perceive as normal. Overbrowsing by deer has led to the loss of the wildflowers and has led to huge changes in the structure of the forest and in the composition of the forest, as well as the successional pathways of our forest. It's altering songbirds and bumblebee communities. We know that historic deer densities are likely to have been around 1 deer for every 100 hectare, and we know that from trying to reconstruct, the amount of camas and other food plants that were harvested and the conditions that must have been the deer densities that would have allowed those harvests to occur. Today, on many of the islands, deer densities are often greater than 1 deer per hectare. So we have a long way to go to bring back balance. Ecoculture restoration, this is possible. This image on the right is from an island in the San Juans where we brought back fire, and we've been propagating and reinstating a lot of those practices that First Nations had developed over millennia. So that included the fire on islands where we can't put back fire. We can think about girdling of the firs that are encroaching on these meadows. There's lots of seed propagation. And of course, then there's also management of other invasive species, broom, hawthorn, exotic grasses, and then we have this deer with wings, which are Canada geese, another species that maybe many of you may not realize, but were actually introduced into the Salish Sea in the Lower Mainland in the 1950s, and have expanded and love to browse these meadows. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tara. That was excellent. As promised, I'd like to just propose a question. So a lot of your research centers obviously around hyperabundance of deer that you spoke about today, and I wonder what would your suggested management strategies be for these deer populations on these islands?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
So we've been working with Parks Canada to help them answer that exact question. And of course, context matters. So on
Mhm.
a small island where you have full control over that, full tenure over that island. So say something like Susquehanam, Halibut Island. Luckily, there's no deer. But say on Sydney Island, next door, that's got joint ownership between the Salis community and the parks. And so they're in discussions about how to manage not just black-tailed deer, but fallow deer. So the strategies that we've seen that are the most cost effective for islands where you have a willing community is hunting, is targeted hunting. We've looked at birth control, we've looked at sterilization, we've looked at fencing. None of those are as cost effective, or actually even as in terms of the sterilization and birth control, have often been put forward as a humane option. But there actually isn't there's very little data to support that, because there's such a high injury and mortality when you're having to catch these animals, not just and perform those procedures on those animals, let alone the cost. So the cost of those procedures are extraordinary. So targeted hunting, and then on places where you can't hunt, fencing out sensitive areas are probably going to be the most important strategies. And we'd like to see the targeted hunting incorporated within like a guardian program where the nations themselves have trained hunters that can come and carry out deer management across the archipelago.
Thank you for that answer. I heard about a study recently that somewhere in the interior, I can't remember exactly which municipality, but they tried to implement a cull to manage the deer population, and at the end, they ended up with a larger deer population than they started with. So I feel like all the literature I've read has pointed to hunting, and especially cultural hunting, as a really great way to manage these populations. So with that, I'm going to remove Tara from the screen and introduce our next speaker. So we're shifting gears a little bit to look at the human element in these ecosystems. And William Reese is joining us as our speaker. I'm just going to give you a quick bio so you know where William is coming from. He's a human ecologist, ecological economist, former director and professor emeritus of the University of British Columbia School of Planning in Vancouver. His research focuses on the ecological requirements for civilization to persist, energy assessment, and the behavioral and socio-cultural barriers to change. Best known as originator and co-developer of ecological footprint analysis, Professor Reese has authored hundreds of peer-reviewed and popular articles. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see this presentation. Let me just get that set up. So I'll share. There we go. And okay, are you seeing that, William?
I am. Thank you very much.
Okay, perfect. So just let me know when to hide the slide or switch the slides. I'm just going to hide myself from the broadcast, but I can still see you.
I'm just going to flap my finger or something. Okay.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. I guess everybody can see where I'm headed here. I will be talking about the human ecological footprint. So you can move on. And I want to put this in context, right? That what we're really talking about is a process called overshoot. And in many respects, Tara's presentation highlighted this, that the population of deer has overshot, obviously, the historic carrying capacity of those islands, and it's completely altered the ecosystems of the islands. And humans have done the same thing for virtually the entire planet. And we're now in a situation where we can see numerous planetary scale changes occurring as a result of excessive human use of natural resources. So we see greenhouse gases accumulating, climate change, oceans are acidifying, fresh waters are toxifying, we're overfishing, soils are eroding, and so on and so on. And what I'd really like to emphasize as we get going here is that everyone today is focused on climate change. But climate change is just one of all of these co-symptoms of this much bigger problem of overshoot. And the irony is that all of the focus on climate change is counterproductive, because everything that we're proposing to do to address climate change will, first of all, not address climate change. That's a whole other presentation, but it's going to worsen overshoot. So all of the symptoms that we're looking at here are going to get worse. Overshoot is a meta problem. And by that, I mean that it's the cause of all of these other things. So they are the symptoms of the meta problem. And what overshoot means is that the human enterprise greatly exceeds the long-term carrying capacity of the planet. If all of these trends, and there's many, many more, continue, then we're done for. This will destroy the ecological integrity of the ecosphere, and climate change will be just one, it's going to accelerate, and it will be one of a number of accelerating symptoms that will simply make a civilized life impossible. So I think it's important to recognize that overshoot is a terminal condition in the end. Let's carry on. So this really leads to the first question of human ecology. And as a kid, I used to lie awake I was a farm boy, so I used to lie awake at night staring at my ceiling, thinking about how much of land do I need just to keep me going? Every one of us is utterly dependent on the productivity of the ecosphere to stay alive. So it becomes a valid question to ask how much of the ecosphere is needed to support just you in the style of which you are accustomed. So that's my first question. Move on. So as time went on, I developed in the course of my professional life this concept of our ecological footprint. And it was an attempt to answer this youthful little question. So definitionally, your ecological footprint is the area of land and water ecosystems required continuously, because it's ongoing, isn't it, to produce all of the biological resources that you or any other population consumes, and to assimilate the wastes that you produce. Consumption always leads to waste production. In fact, everything we consume ultimately reemerges into the ecosphere as waste. And so we're now drawing on resources all over the planet. And so we have to consider our eco footprints as extending all over the planet. Another thing to keep in mind is that land that is required, or ecosystems required to support population A, are exclusive. They cannot support some other alternative population. Move on, please. Okay. In effect, ecological footprint analysis inverts the carrying capacity ratio. So carrying capacity asks this question: how many people could this area support indefinitely at a specified standard of living? We don't ask that question anymore. The young woman who introduced the session made the point that economists have said, well, it's an irrelevant question for human beings because we can trade, and technological advances enable us to increase the carrying capacity of our particular area. So it doesn't make any sense, they say, to ask how many people can this area support. I think this is a complete delusion, but we'll get to that in a moment. Ecological footprint analysis asks a slightly different question. And that is, how much area is required to support this population at any specific standard, no matter where that area is. So again, instead of asking how many people in this area, okay, we've got these people in this area, but they don't live there ecologically. If they're living on goods imported from somewhere else, we can still compute the area that is required to sustain them, even though that may be half a planet away and accessed through global trade. So another thing that ecological footprint analysis does is enable us not only to assess the demands that people are making on ecosystems by measuring the actual ecosystem area, wherever it is needed to support a population, we can compare that to the supply of biocapacity. So if we look at the Gulf Islands, for example, and we were to calculate the ecological footprint of people who live on the Gulf Islands, well, I know we would. I used to live on Gabriola, and I did it for Gabriola Island. The population there, which is relatively small, vastly exceeds the carrying capacity of Gabriola Island. There's no conceivable way that the islands could support the populations that they currently have on them. And that's because, again, economists, well, we've raised the carrying capacity. No, we haven't. What we've done is extended the reach of those people through trade and imports to somebody else's carrying capacity somewhere else. So we're all living on borrowed carrying capacity. Let's move on, please. So if we look at this in terms of international circumstances, we see very quickly that ecological footprints, the amount of area needed to support any individual person or nation, is very, very much dependent on income. Income also means consumption. Almost invariably, as incomes go up, consumption increases. So high-income countries have very large ecological footprints. It takes, for high-income countries, between 4 and 10 average global hectares, that's 10 to 25 acres, to support a single person in terms of all the biomass and fiber and so on needed to sustain that individual, plus to assimilate our waste, particularly our carbon dioxide. That's the carbon sink function that is being overloaded because of excess use of fossil fuels, and hence we're seeing a climate change. So the carbon footprint is a big part of the ecological footprint. Now, the poorest people on Earth live on 1/3 to 1/2 of a hectare, which is obviously a tiny fraction, less than 10% of the lowest end of high-income countries. So there's a great misallocation, in a sense, of resources, or at least unequal allocation of resources that depends very much on incomes. So the ecological footprint clearly reflects the great disparity between rich and poor, which we're seeing increasing between nations as well as even within nations. The rich people are getting more and more, and very poor people are sharing less and less of a global economy. Now, there's several important things to understand here. First of all, if it is true that our average footprints in rich countries varies from 4 to 10 hectares, we can compare that to what's available on the planet. And I don't care how many books you consult or geographical analyses you rely on, we can show that there's only about 12 to 13 billion hectares of ecologically productive land and waters on Earth. Most of the oceans, for example, are effectively a biological desert. So this means there's only about 1.7 average hectare per capita on the planet of land and water sufficiently productive to support human populations. So that we in North America, with our footprints of around 8 hectares per capita, are using 4 to 5 times our fair share of global carrying capacity. Next. This is what it looks like, just a spread of countries. United States, Australia, Canada are very high footprint countries. Way down at the far end are some countries in Asia and Africa, such as Bangladesh and Malawi. So it's a very steep gradient from wealthy to poor. But the thing to keep in mind is this horizontal red line. This represents what I call, what analysts in this domain call, one planet living. So that if we were all equitably sharing the biocapacity of Earth and living on our equitable share, our fair share, we'd each get about 1.6 hectares. Well, as I say, we're in Canada taking 4 or 5 times that amount. And this is the standard of living that we would enjoy, something like the level of Peru or Ethiopia. That is what the Earth could sustain indefinitely, representing the carrying capacity of the planet. And by the way, we're not taking into account here the needs of non-human species. There's another big problem, and that is that although there's only 1.5 or 1.6 global average hectares available on Earth per capita, the average eco footprint of the human population today, even at today's very unequal standards of living, is 2.7 gigahectares, or average hectares, not gigahectares. So in effect, we're using the Earth as if it were about 73% larger than the planet actually is. Next, please. This just gives an example of individual countries. The green bars represent domestic biocapacity. The red bars represent the amount of the Earth's productive biocapacity required by the populations of those countries. And you can see that most of the European countries are dependent now to a very large extent on imported carrying capacity. Some very poor countries are in that state as well. Canada is among a very few countries on Earth where our nominal biocapacity greatly exceeds our actual demands. But don't let that fool you. I've been told in Ottawa a number of times that we're in great shape because we have so much surplus, but we don't. We trade this all off. 63%, for example, of our prairie lands, half of our forest products and fisheries are sold off in the world markets to sustain people in countries with an excess footprint over their available biocapacity. So when economists say we increase carrying capacity by technology or trade, it's not quite true. What we're doing is shuffling carrying capacity around the world so that people in very wealthy countries through the market can access the surplus carrying capacity in the few countries like Canada that have a surplus, or like Malaysia where incomes are so low that they don't consume all of their own biocapacity. So the point is most countries in the world today are dependent on surplus biocapacity that they import from other countries. And they are running what I call an ecological deficit. The ecological deficits of countries is vastly more important than their physical or economic deficits, and yet no one pays any attention to them whatsoever. Because what an ecological deficit means is, certainly on a global scale, is that we are living not on the annual productivity of our ecosystems, but we're using all of that plus some of the natural capital. So fishery stocks are declining, our soils are being eroded, tropical forests are disappearing. We are literally consuming the biophysical basis of our own existence and pretending that we're increasing carrying capacity because it's made all invisible by trade and so on. Next slide, please. Globally then, in 2017, that's the latest numbers, the human footprint was about 20.9 billion hectares. The global biocapacity was only about 12 billion hectares, and so we're 73% larger. We're using the Earth as if it's about 73% larger than it actually is. So what this means is that further growth of the population and incomes, material consumption, can occur only by depleting essential natural capital and through the loss of life support functions. And that means we're fatally compromising future well-being. And those of us in British Columbia who've watched the ravages of fires and heat domes, and most recently these extraordinary floods in the Lower Mainland, know exactly what this means. These are the products of the excessive human ecological footprint on planet Earth. And the more we promote economic and population growth, the worse these conditions are going to get. And climate change isn't going to abate because of our efforts to abate climate change. Move on, please. So what we are missing, right away, you can move, click the button again, something like 4 planets. If everyone on Earth lived the lifestyles of North Americans, we would need 3 or 4 additional Earth-like planets to support them at our material standards for sustainability. Next. We're into a situation which nobody talks about. Everyone approves of economic growth, but what about non-economic or uneconomic growth? A concept developed by a colleague called Herman Daly, one of the deans of ecological economics. So as economic growth increases along the x-axis here, obviously there's a great gain from that, but there's also costs increasing as the scale of the economy increases. So for much of the development of the human enterprise, the gains from growth, the marginal utility, if you like, of growth, exceeded the costs of the disutility. But you reach a point right here where the two are equal. And what that means is that if you continue to grow and consume, both in population and the use of energy and materials, then you pass the point where the disutility, or the cost of growth, again, think of all the damage costs, the billions of dollars damage costs of recent climate events, exceeds the benefits of that growth. And that makes your growth useless because, in fact, growing further is making you poorer rather than richer. So there is some optimal scale to the economy at which there's a coincidence between the marginal gains from growth and the marginal costs. And we've long passed that in the earth, I believe, at this point. Next, please. So the real sustainable challenge is that we need a new cultural narrative. We need to have a discussion nationally and globally that shifts the emphasis away from efficiency and growth, which really means just getting bigger, toward equity and development, a qualitative improvement, or getting better. So the overall goal of global development planning should be, and this just sticks in the craw of most people, a smaller, steady state economy supporting far fewer people living more equally within the biophysical means of nature. Now, that seems to most people to be an impossible goal, but I assure you that if we don't achieve this, then the future will achieve it for us. Nature's revenge will be a much smaller population living in chaos on a much smaller economic base, because we are literally, and again, I can't underscore this enough, all of those symptoms that we listed in the second slide are indicators that we're literally eroding out from under ourselves the foundations of the existence of not only the human species or civilization, but non-human species as well. We won't destroy the planet or the ecosphere, but we can make it essentially uninhabitable by human beings. Next, please. So the really inconvenient truth, and look at this. This goes back to 1973, and it's actually a report of the International Business Council on Sustainable Development. And they recognized then, based on all kinds of data, that industrialized world reductions in consumption, energy use, and environmental degradation of 90% will be required by 2040 to meet the needs of the growing population within the planet's ecological means. North Americans, by our analyses, the footprint analyses, should be taking steps to reduce their ecological footprints by 75 to 80% down to the fair earth share. Western Europeans should be thinking about a 60% reduction. Now, again, put that in the context of a world that expects to grow indefinitely and at least at the rate of 2 to 3% per year. That pathway leads to chaos and destruction of the ecosphere. This is really what you need to do to become sustainable. Next slide, please. There's a convenient truth associated with these details. This curve represents the nations of the world plotted against life expectancy of various countries against per capita incomes. And life expectancy is just a surrogate for any number of variables of population health. And what you see is a very strong correlation with rising income. You get better and better until a certain point, at which point, beyond which there is no further improvement. So if we are destroying the planet by going from, say, 20,000 to 50,000 a year with no improvement in life quality as indicated by life expectancy, this is unnecessary growth. And we can see this happening in Canada. One study showed that between 76 and 2006, the 30-odd year period, the Canadian economy grew by 130%, per capita GDP by 70%, but there was no change in the percentage of the population in poverty or in the unemployment rate, which means there were a lot more people in poverty and a lot more unemployed people. So the absolute numbers of impoverished and employed increased, and subjective well-being, people's sense of how well off they were, was constant or declining through this period. So we are actually gaining nothing at all by additional income growth. What we need to look to is shrinking and more equitable distribution of what we have. Next slide. So here's the bottom line, and I think you have to take this very serious. In the coming decades, the human enterprise will contract. It will contract because we choose to do so, or because nature will impose its own solution. And we're beginning to see that happening. A lot of the habitat on this planet will become uninhabitable in the next few years. In fact, it was interesting this morning listening to the reports of the recent floods that some people lost not only their homes, but literally the land has eroded away. They lost their property because of the recent flooding. Well, again, it's a small example here, but it's indicative of what we can look forward to at an accelerating rate in the future. So we can choose business as usual, and that's what governments are choosing. That's what came out of COP26, business as usual. But this risks a chaotic implosion imposed by nature, which will be followed by geopolitical turmoil and resource wars. You may be hearing now about the US and Russia getting increasingly tense, between the United States and China, increasing tensions, and basically over land and resources when you really boil it all down. Or the human community can rise to full human potential, and we are intelligent enough to see what's happening, and come together to cooperate in planning an orderly cooperative descent toward what people keep talking about as a socially just sustainability for all. That's the ideal, but we're not doing anything really to achieve it. Can we move on, please? All right. The good news is that we actually have the technology to induce a 75 to 80% reduction while still improving quality of life. We just don't apply it. We don't act. Privileged elites with the greatest stake in the status quo control policy levers, and ordinary people hold on to the expansionist myth, so we remain in a state of eco paralysis. Move on, please. Humans have been socially engineered to ignore reality in this age of what the Oxford English Language Dictionary called it's the post-truth era, where bullshit appears to be of equal value to scientific truths. So most of us prefer the bullshit if it makes us feel good or means that we don't really have to act. We will always go to the theater of a reassuring lie and avoid the inconvenient truth. Move on, please. So simplistic thinking, the human way, leads us to think that wind turbines, photovoltaics, electric vehicles, smart cities, geoengineering, and all of this stuff is going to help us. The world full of electric vehicles will not be a better world for a whole variety of reasons. Again, another topic. And then a world full of internal combustion engine vehicles. This stuff is really nothing more than growth-bound business as usual via alternative means, and will lead to a formal collapse of the global ecosystem. It's simple, but wrong. The complex but right way of thinking about this is moving towards smaller eco-footprints, lifestyle changes, greater equality, population planning, some form of degrowth leading to improved well-being, including eco-stability and economic security. In other words, if we have overshot the carrying capacity of the planet, as is clearly shown through eco-footprint analysis, we need to reduce the scale of the human impact and human numbers to the point where the planet can support us. Next slide, please. And I think this is the last one, but it's something really important to think about. What is ecologically and socially necessary for sustainability is not politically feasible. And we saw that again at COP26. But what is politically feasible, the sorts of things that politicians will currently entertain, is ecologically and socially ineffective, if not catastrophic. And I guess that's really the final message. We have to change the dialogue to make those things that are necessary also feasible in political terms. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rees, for that very detailed and sobering view at ecological footprint analysis. I think that's really helpful for everyone here today to engage with that topic a little further. One of the questions that I've been thinking about throughout your presentation, as you discussed, shuffling carrying capacity globally, with rich countries often benefiting from others' surplus biocapacity. Over the past year and a half with the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw lots of interruptions to global trade and global travel. Of course, recently here in BC, we've seen more climatic events, fire seasons and flooding events. You discussed this a little bit with, of course, systemic challenges with society, simplistic thinking, but do you personally believe that these events in our recent history will change our view of ecological footprinting, carrying capacity, and consumption?
It's well known in psychological circles that social change is a very difficult process. We're involved today in something called social learning. And, you know, people do respond to some degree to new information, but not very much. We've known about climate change for some 30 to 50 years. We've seen, that it's actually happening. The theory goes back 150 years. And yet nothing really has been done to reverse the steady uptick in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. So we've had 26 climate meetings, 6 formal agreements, including the Kyoto Agreement and the Paris Accord, which were apparently partially legally binding. It has no effect on the steady increase. So nations do not stick to the commitments that they make because the process of sinking through the real meaning of these changes is a very long one. It takes decades for social learning to take effect in a serious manner. Unfortunately, people seem to need to be shocked out of their positions by some catastrophic event. So we've heard, if you've been listening to the radio, many people in the last couple of weeks have said, look, I really did take climate change seriously until my house floated down the river, and now I believe in it. And unfortunately, that seems to be the human dilemma, that we become comfortable. By the way, it's good evolutionary reasons why we should stay comfortable with a particular situation. We evolved when things didn't change very much. So if you became content with it and adapted to it, that was fine. But today things are changing so rapidly that a mental mindset or a psychological predisposition that doesn't respond to rapid change is no longer adaptive. So we've literally changed the environment around us, the global environment, so that the selection pressures on our own species is changing. These are evolutionary terms to mean that kinds of behaviors that once favored our existence are now unfavorable. They become disadvantageous in the world we've created ourselves. And so we're in a very, very different circumstance here. And we know these things. So we really have to raise them to consciousness so that people learn they have to change before the circumstances force them to do so. And I can assure you, they will force us to do so, just as folks in these floods have learned that, maybe the Fraser Valley is uninhabitable, given the kind of climate circumstances that we're seeing.
Yes, thank you very much. And now I would like to introduce our last presenter of the afternoon. The Galliano Conservancy Association is a community-based nonprofit society and registered charity dedicated to preserving and enhancing the human and natural environment on Galliano Island, which is on the traditional and unceded territory of the Penelakut and Hulitsum First Nations and other Hulkaminam-speaking peoples, and the Hosainich Nation, and the ceded territory of the Tsawwassen First Nation. Among several projects happening at the Galliano Conservancy right now, one of the questions the Galliano Conservancy is hoping to answer is, can the Galliano community live within one Earth? And can it live within one island through their One Island, One Earth project? And before I hand it over to our guests, Adam and Michelle, who are representatives of the Galliano Conservancy, I'd just like to encourage the audience to plug away with their questions for all of our presenters in the chat, as we will be transitioning to the discussion period after this. But until then, I'll hand it over to Adam and Michelle. Thanks, guys.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much for having us here today. I think that William's presentation was kind of a great lead up to ours, because we're kind of at a more community level, but applying kind of similar concepts. My name is Michelle. I'm the One Island, One Earth coordinator at the Galliano Conservancy, and this is my colleague Adam Huggins, and he's the restoration coordinator here.
Hey!
And this here is our puppet Soul, which has been kind of our project's mascot here on the island. So we thought we'd bring him here to join today as well. So for those who don't know, I'm assuming most everybody knows where Galliano is in the Coast Salish Sea. But Galliano Island is kind of the first island leading up to, you can go back one more, in between Victoria and Vancouver. Our population, we have a lot of part-time residents and full-time residents, and we do have a little bit more of the aging population in kind of the 60 plus is where more of the people living here are. So for this project, we've kind of looked at 3 different areas. One is the ecological footprint, one is the biocapacity of the island, and the third is the ecological fingerprint. So we're going to go a little bit deeper into these 3 concepts. So I'll let you talk a bit about the ecological footprint.
Yeah, hello everyone. And I mean, it's really it's not every day that you get to to speak about the ecological footprint right after Dr. William Rees. So it was pretty amazing to hear you speak to it. And of course, the work that we're doing here is built just completely upon those concepts, right? So I don't think we have to go any further into what the ecological footprint is. I think he covered that really well. But I do want to talk about this concept of ecological fingerprinting that we're working with. And if you can flip the slide. So we were looking around as a small island community to see if anybody had done an ecological footprint for a small island community before. Because the concept originated here in British Columbia, it's been applied now to Vancouver and to Victoria, to Saanich, to even smaller communities like Powell River and other municipalities. But we couldn't find any other islands that had actually attempted to do an ecological footprint analysis for themselves. And we had to look to Europe to find one. And so the only other island that we were able to find that's really done a complete analysis was Helgoland in Germany, which is this tiny little island off the coast of Germany. It's largely tourist-based economy, kind of like us. Unlike us, it's a very tiny island and there's no motor vehicles there. So it's very access only and foot traffic. So in many ways, it is a similar kind of situation. In many ways, it is quite different. But we got in touch with the scientist who performed the analysis, Dr. Beate Rader, and we talked with her about the project, and we were convinced that we would be able to do something like this for Galliano Island. So that's kind of the impetus for the project. And she suggested to us that because island communities have a lot of what she calls social capital, that there's a lot of economic activity that goes on islands and in small tight-knit communities everywhere that is really hard to quantify, that it's better to think of it as an ecological fingerprint than it is as an ecological footprint. And so we're kind of trying to pursue multiple avenues of both quantifying and qualifying this ecological footprint and fingerprint for the island.
Yeah, you can go to the next slide. So the general ecological footprint concept kind of has these 5 areas. And as a small island that doesn't have a municipality, finding data to start with our project was a little bit challenging. I mean, we were able to do some areas like get some stuff from ICBC and BC Ferries and kind of those bigger external resources. But we initially found some data gaps for food waste and transportation. Transportation in the sense of how much are people driving on the island. So since we identified those data gaps, we decided to do community surveys to gather our own data for these areas. So we had a food survey, had residents record what they ate, whether it was on island or off island, and how much for an entire week. We had people sorting and weighing their waste for us. And then we also had a transportation survey where people would give us their starting odometer. And a few months later, we would write back asking for their ending odometer, as well as their car make and model. So this kind of community data I think is very valuable, and we're very open and willing to, if other communities are interested in doing a similar project and need a proxy and that type of thing, we're willing to share as well, because we think we're welcome to more people doing a similar type thing.
Yeah, and I'll say, we sort of have been learning this by doing it, and starting to understand why for some of these larger analyses you would use top-down data. It's very hard to build data from the ground up, but the result is that you really know where the numbers are coming from and have an idea of how they were derived. And I think that's quite valuable for us, not just in calculating the ecological footprint, but in taking the ecological footprint back to the community and looking at how we can improve things. And, as Dr. Rees was saying, how we can sort of look at what that degrowth future looks like on a small island like Galliano.
Definitely. Next slide. Yeah, so we've been working with BCIT EcoCity, and that's who we've been giving our data to for them to apply all their algorithms. And they've done a similar project for the District of Saanich, Vancouver, and Powell River. So you can see here it would take 2 Earths if everybody lived like a resident in the District of Saanich. Same with Vancouver. Powell River is more 3.5. So we're interested to see how Galliano compares to these other communities. We have no idea what the results will be. We haven't gotten them yet, but there are other resources, like you can read about the City of Vancouver's report is public that you can look at, and same with the District of Saanich, if anybody's interested in kind of reading further into into those communities. Next slide.
Right, biocapacity. So Dr. Rees spoke to this a little bit, but essentially, when we're looking at biocapacity, oftentimes the comparisons that you get in terms of what Michelle was just talking about, in terms of, you know, Vancouver residents, if everyone lived like them, you'd need 2 Earths. Those are based on the sort of abstracted global hectares measurement, which is, you know, a way of quantifying these things at scale. We were actually quite curious to answer the question that Dr. Rees posed earlier on, which is, you know, could the residents of an island like Gabriola live within the actual productivity of the island itself? And, you know, he answered fairly confidently that they would not be able to. We also believe that we are going to overshoot our island by a good bit, and we just don't know how much. We're quite curious. You know, the residents of Helgoland apparently overshoot their island by like 8 times or something like that. No, yeah.
7 or 8.
7 or 8 times. So, you know, the other part of this process is calculating the biocapacity. And, you know, I think when we were talking about carrying capacity originally in this webinar, you know, we were a little worried that community residents would kind of take this to mean that, oh, well, if we can't, you know, live within the means of the island, then we must have to reduce our population significantly. And we're not necessarily saying that. It just depends on how we live together as a community on these islands. And, you know, as we've seen from Indigenous people living in this region since time immemorial, it's possible to sustain very significant populations sustainably on islands like these. So,
yeah. So we've been working with the Global Footprint Network and compiling different data sets for them. So what's kind of going into our documentation of biocapacity is the aerial imagery that we have that's been provided. We've been updating the land use map, which has been quite a task. I think most of the islands in the Islands Trust are from the early 2000s, so getting an updated land use map was a bit of a task. And then we've also, luckily through the Islands Trust, we've also have standing carbon and annual sequestration values, which are very helpful in calculating the biocapacity, as well as marine MPP. So we've been taking things like our eelgrass mapping data and forage fishing and that type of thing to kind of put that all together for biocapacity for the island. One of the questions, though, that we've also been struggling with is how much marine is set aside for Galliano, because we are between a bunch of major cities, including Vancouver, Victoria, and Seattle. Is it really fair for a small island community to kind of take that for the biocapacity of this island, which has been a constant debate that we've been having?
Yes, we go back and forth on this. I mean, because essentially, you know, it's our understanding that people who've lived in these islands, you know, for long periods of time, pre-European settlement and then even post-European settlement for quite some time, you know, derived a lot of their sustenance from marine resources. And that has just been something that's decreased and decreased and decreased and decreased over time. And so the question of how to factor that into the biocapacity has been a very sticky question. And we are actually still in the process of making a decision on how we're going to do that. So, you know, stay tuned.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's the general gist of what we're using to calculate the biocapacity.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the ecological fingerprint, so we've been thinking about this a bunch of different ways, because, you know, the numbers tell one story, and it's a really important story. It's not the only story. And so we've been going through and actually doing oral history interviews with a number of island residents, and especially going after old timers and Indigenous elders, people who have a lot of local knowledge and who understand how the ecosystems and social systems of these islands have changed over time. And, you know, it's been really amazing interviewing these people, I will say. And, you know, we'll be kind of processing those interviews and trying to figure out how best to present that to the rest of the island community in a way that kind of supports what, you know, is supportive of the results that we put out with the ecological footprint, but also contextualizes them and helps present some avenues for how things have happened in the past, what things could be like in the future. You know, talking to some of these people, I think it's just been amazing to us to realize that we, you know, as young people, we know that there's been a lot of change and that a lot of things have been lost. Sometimes you don't even know what you don't know. And that really speaks to what Tara Martin was talking about with shifting baselines. It's, you know, it's a huge issue. And so hopefully some of these interviews will help put that in perspective. We also have a bunch of other sort of ecological footprint, fingerprint related activities that we're planning and that are in the works that include art and engaging with the school kids, and of course our puppets here, which have become a bit of a Galliano Conservancy staple over the pandemic. So we'll be working on those in the coming months.
Next slide. So different ways that we're planning on sharing our findings with the community. Well, the bottom line is no matter what we find with our results is that we want to learn from it and share with everybody what we found. But a lot of this data that we are collecting is a really great baseline data for the Galliano community. But if you guys stay tuned, in early March, we will hopefully be presenting all of our results in kind of a community event situation, which I think will be great. We'll also be producing a technical report, contributing to a podcast and lots of other different ways to kind of make all of our information accessible to the public to learn, and whoever's interested in that. As well as our technical report, we're also hoping to kind of create the general framework for if other island communities want to do a similar project. So kind of we're calling it like a toolkit to other islands to see what data they would need or how to do it again. Yeah, with faster or cheaper options than we've been doing. Learn from our mistakes.
Yeah, we've been doing this for several years now, and it's been really fun putting this together. And hopefully, what we've learned can make it easier for other people to do this. We've thought of a number of different scenarios. You could imagine the entire Gulf Islands or Islands Trust region creating an ecological footprint from the ground up based on the different islands, because all the islands are a little bit different. Mm-hmm. You could also imagine some friendly inter-island competition. I already know that there's some Galliano islands that are tallying electric vehicles per capita with Salt Spring and trying to stay ahead on Galliano. Of course, we know electric vehicles aren't the only solution.
Yeah.
But, that's something that's already happening. So anyway, that's what we kind of imagine coming out of this project for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I've just provided some of the further reading there for if you want to learn about the Helgoland or look at either the City of Vancouver or District of Saanich report. Does anybody have any questions?
Hello. Thank you for that. That was very good. And I think it was a good tone to go to after the previous presentation, which was also very informative, but just a different take. So something that I have been wondering since I first heard about this project is, I know that a big goal for this project is to be replicable and implementable on other islands, as you said near the end of your presentation. And I just wonder if you recommend having some kind of an organizational affiliation like the Galliano Conservancy, or is this like an undertaking that could potentially be done by an individual or group, like grassroots group of folks? Like, do you need that kind of organizational support to be able to pull something like this off?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
I mean, not necessarily. I will say that, if you see that list of partners and funders at the end of our slideshow there, like it takes significant funding to do this. And it took a lot of partnerships to get this going, not the least of which is with Lalem Saratineo, the Coast Salish Peoples of Galliano Society, which is where all those wonderful images come from, and where I think a lot of the analysis of the results is going to come from too, from a local perspective, right? So I think those partnerships are critical. I think the Conservancy is in a particularly good place to do this because we have the sort of infrastructure to support the number crunching on the back end, the office space to actually do it and compile the results, trust within the community, and lots of supporters. It would be hard to do this without some kind of organizational supports, I think, but not necessarily impossible.
Mm-hmm. It'll be even more easy to do once these frameworks come out from Galliano Conservancy, which is a great service. So I'm going to welcome Tara back to the stream. We unfortunately lost William Reese at 113. I didn't actually know that he was going to be hopping off, but I have done a poor job throughout this series of trying to rein people in to stick to their times because I've gotten so enraptured by people's wonderful presentations, and I've been learning so much personally. So maybe that's a selfish outcome of these presentations, but we still do have about 8 minutes for questions. So I'm going to let Persia actually take the reins on this question period. So just a quick shout out to the audience. If you haven't already entered your questions, please do so now, and I'll keep monitoring that. But Persia, I'll turn it over to you for those questions.
Yeah, I'd like to pose a question to everybody here to kind of get us started. But I think a general theme for today is that something's got to give in terms of our resource use and consumption, our habits, our lifestyle. And I was wondering if both folks at the Galliano Conservancy and Tara, if anyone would like to kind of, if you had one piece of advice to maybe some audience members who are feeling a bit powerless right now, or want to take some individual action or engage in collective action, what would you tell audience members and myself?
Use the power of your wallet and stop buying so much stuff.
That's a good one.
That's a really good start. I actually want to throw back to what Tara was talking about earlier, with deer overabundance and hunting being one of the most impactful ways. We've been looking at food consumption on Galliano Island, and we're actually doing quite well compared to the national averages, which is really interesting. Mm-hmm. We were a little bit shocked by the numbers because they were lower than even we thought they would be on some categories. And so, we've been talking a lot with people about meat and about protein that comes from the island. And the deer on these islands are overabundant. They're a conservation issue. They're also a huge resource for living sustainably locally. And one of the things that we're working to do as an organization is to make that link between conservation and, in this case, hunting, and also indigenous sovereignty and food security, right? And we work with hunters from Penelakut to do hunting workshops here at the Millard Learning Center every year. And there's a lot of kinks to work out on underlying these systems, because a lot of this stuff is not commonly practiced anymore. But one thing that Gulf Island people can do is consider their relationship to the land, and to indigenous peoples of the land here, and consider opening their properties to hunting. Consider when people are practicing harvesting activities from the land, consider not being mean to those people, not trying to drive them away. It's something that when we talk to our indigenous collaborators and they say, I was harvesting oysters, or I was harvesting shellfish the other day, and this person told me to get off their beach. That happens. That happens, more frequently than I think a lot of us would expect. And so, I think there are a lot of solutions here. And I guess I went on a bit of a tangent with this one, but it's been on my mind, and it's all related, right?
No, that's great. I think a lot of us are coming to terms, maybe with more recent history, that things are not able to continue as they have. And we talked a lot about business as usual. So it's great to, put some of these solutions or suggestions out into the audience and, see what we can do. A question from an audience member, Steve, for the Galliano Conservancy. They're wondering if Galliano has reviewed the Samso Island in Denmark, I believe, for ecological footprinting.
No,
I don't think so.
That would be news to us. So it's possible there are other islands out there that have done work like this. Steve, I guess we can't talk directly to Steve, but if you have information about other islands that have performed ecological footprint analyses, we'd love to see them. There are some other islands, for example, the U.S. Virgin Islands did an energy footprint about a decade ago. And so partial footprints have been done in various places. I believe the Seychelles did a footprint of tourism analysis. So there are different approaches, but in terms of like a complete ecological footprint and biocapacity analysis, we've only seen it happen with Helgoland. So we'd love that information if you have it. Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
I'm going to just hop in with a question that I think is really important that just came in. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot too, about how we all know that BC is in a housing crisis right now. And given that reality, how can we address the ecological carrying capacity of these islands and at the same time pursue this degrowth economy and make sure that people have access to safe, clean, affordable housing? Like where it's a real I don't expect you to have this answer that all of us are struggling to find, but just like some thoughts on that would be really valuable, I think.
This is a really important issue, and it's something that Bill raised is that the folks generally with higher incomes consume more resources. So, a 10,000 square foot home on Salt Spring is not the equivalent of 5 tiny homes. And so I think this is what we need to keep in mind, is that we can actually have growth that is done, or I won't say growth, I'll say just housing that is done in a good way, that is done with a low footprint. And that is what a lot of the affordable housing projects are about, is providing housing for people in a good way. And that is something that we should be supporting on our islands. And maybe we should be rethinking whether, 2 people building a 10,000, a 15,000 square foot home is something that we want in our islands. And perhaps if folks are going to do that, then maybe they need to be held to a higher standard in terms of all of the types of building materials that they use, the self-sufficiency of that building. So I think that this is a huge issue, because our islands are under siege from folks that have extraordinary means, and they're building these extraordinary, colossal buildings. And while, at the same time, these island communities are struggling to house residents and families that have been there for generations.
Yeah. A lot of these buildings are also empty much of the year. If anybody's been watching Netflix's series Made, I think it gives you a decent idea of the different ways that people live in communities like this, and how strikingly different they can be. And so, yeah, people's footprints are certainly not equal, even within the same community. And I think, for many of us, housing is a huge priority. And I just wanted to reiterate that what we're doing, I hope, does not necessarily communicate to people that somehow, we necessarily need to have less human population on these islands. In some cases, like on an island like Galliano, having more people, especially younger people, younger families, being able to live here actually makes the economy work more efficiently. And can potentially help us reduce our footprint in the long run by having that kind of energy locally. So it's not necessarily it's the complex route, right? It's not the simple solution.
Totally. So I hate to stop this, because we truly have 3 pages of questions that Persia and I assembled because we were so stoked to talk to you folks. But we are at 1:30, and I know people have other commitments and have to go on their way. So I'd just like to thank all of you so much for being here. This has been very valuable. And everyone, this recording will be available on YouTube immediately after we shut off the broadcast. So feel free to share far and wide. So thank you everyone for being here. And we'll see you next week for our final webinar in the series.
Right.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.